Good evening and welcome to Law Talk, the show that brings the law, the Constitution, and the events of today to you each show. Tonight, myself, James Barrett, and Mark Malachowski are going to be covering three exciting subjects. Mark, what's our first subject for the night?
Well, our first subject tonight is, Elvis Presley, who's the king of rock and roll, who was a very good performer, and he just happened to come along right when TV started being very popular. So he was actually the first rock star that was on TV. So he became incredibly famous. And now his estate is worth a lot of money from all the residuals. And there's a family feud between Priscilla Presley, who's a grandma to Riley Keough, and they're in a court dispute over a 2016 trust amendment that takes the power of being co-trustee from Priscilla Presley, who's grandma, and the manager of Barry Siegel, who was co-trustee, and this is all going back to Lisa Marie Presley's trust.
Yeah, okay. So this all came about because Lisa Marie Presley died unexpectedly. And of course, she's the legacy daughter of the king. And because he did start in the 50s, did follow the growth of TV, did set a standard that may never be matched in any performer or any band or any individual in history. And unfortunately, this is about greed, isn't it, Mark?
Well, it's definitely a dispute over a fair amount of money. Now, there's been disputes in the past where people claim that the manager, Barry Siegel, kind of depleted the trust. That was about $100 million, and then that got, funds taken out of that. And then looking at the value of the trust, could be upwards worth about $850 million. So there's a lot of money riding on this one.
Well, we know that there's a lot of residuals being generated nonstop in music, in clothing, in trinkets, and we have Graceland, which is one of the largest visited sites in all the United States because of the historic importance of Elvis and his legacy.
So anyway, what this 2016 Trust Amendment does, it takes away the co-trusteeship from Barry Siegel and Priscilla Presley, and it gives it to Riley Keough and her brother Benjamin Keough, but Benjamin has passed away. So that leaves Riley pretty much in the driver's seat.
Okay, do we have any information of what Riley is really trying to do with that legacy?
Well, there's a lot of dispute on that. And what, Lisa Marie had kind of put Priscilla Presley as a co-trustee, but up to there in the will, Priscilla Presley wasn't getting much, so she kind of got put in that position. Whereas, we're looking Riley, descendants, and she's in a pretty good spot just as far as as hereditary goes,
Right, of course. And what's interesting about all of this is you wonder, why would that Mr. Siegel, Barry Siegel, be involved at all? And what I do understand, there was a lot of mismanagement of Lisa Marie's money under Barry Siegel, but they don't seem to implicate Priscilla in the misuse of that money. But the question then comes, that amendment you're talking about, wasn't that in 2016?
Yeah, it was 2016. Now, Lisa Marie in 1993, that's when Priscilla became co-trustee. But then there's a 2016 amendment which changes that trusteeship, and that's what we're disputing right now. And there's all kinds of...
well, what are they disputing, Mark?
Well, they're disputing whether that amendment is valid.
Oh, and what would make it not valid, Mark?
Well, there's a variety of things that would make it not valid, but what they're alleging here is they're saying, first of all, the signature doesn't really look like Lisa Marie Presley's signature. So they're disputing the signature. Now, people's signatures do change over time, and you can have different signatures. And I work on cases that involve signatures all the time, and I have an expert who's, used to work for the Secret Service, and he's used to looking at signatures. But it's very hard to look at a signature and say that's a good signature or not. You need several signatures around that time. The more signatures or handwriting samples you have, the better you can
do a comparison.
Then the better you can make some kind of assessment. Now, on the other hand, they do have a lot of technical things now. With looking at things through microscopes and all kinds of equipment that really can look at signatures and tell a lot.
Well, I know that from the background that I was involved with in criminal justice, I know that you look at everything from the amount of pressure you put on the page.
You can see that from the paper.
I mean, the simplistic things are like the loop and L, the loop and a P. Do you put a line across a T, or do you kind of just mark it separately? Is everything in a flow? So if all those factors, you think they're going to bring in at least 2, if not more, forensic experts are going to review that signature. And at that point, at least that might give them something to consider. But are there other problems with the amendment?
Well, yeah, there's a signature, which is a big one, and that's a question here. And the other one is that there's a misspelling of Lisa Marie Presley's name.
What? A misspelling?
Yeah, that's what they're claiming. And so that would be a problem, because you would think that if someone was going to sign a trust, they would be able to notice that their name was misspelled. And I'm not saying, I don't know if it's just a signature block or throughout the document, but a misspelling anywhere of the name is a little bit of a problem. Now, this thing comes up with married names and things and hyphenated names. So you do have some times where you go, well, let's look at the marriage certificates, look at the birth certificates, and there's some kind of explanation here. But I don't think there's anything here that would be a reason for a misspelling of a name or a different spelling or something.
You know what's interesting? I've never seen, they haven't released to the public this alleged amendment, have they?
Well, that was kind of the argument of Priscilla Presley. She was saying, look, we didn't know about this until after Lisa Marie Presley passed away. So it was a surprise to us. Which that can happen, you don't have to publicize when you do an amendment. But
well, there is one thing I noticed in this trust. There was actually a specific term that said, should the change of trustees come about, the old trustees must be notified of that change. And this is one of the points in this that could be the crucial change in court, and that is that Priscilla Presley and Barry Siegel were never given any notice that this was changed.
Yeah, well, there's a little problem with that, because then, well, there were notice on Lisa Marie Presley's death, but not at the time of...
Not when Lisa Marie was alive, that she was making a change.
Not when they had it, when she signed or didn't, when she, apparently signed the trust. And there's also some questions about the dates, like maybe some dates were added later, or there was a PDF or something like that. So, and that's always a problem. Dates, should coincide. Now, there's certain situations where a date wouldn't be perfect. Say, for example, you wanted to notarize something, and you didn't have a valid ID, and you had to wait and get it notarized later once you get your ID taken care of. I mean, there are reasons to have something dated, with an attachment.
Well,
but in general, having the date at the time of signature being correct is a pretty big deal.
Well, you know what, we're going to wind this up, because this is going to be coming out in the public, and it's going to keep growing. But the last thing when you have a regular signature, then you have a PDF date.
Yeah.
And on that happy note, which we'll leave for our viewers, what's our second subject tonight, Mark?
So the next thing we're going to talk about is a constitutional issue, First Amendment, freedom of speech kind of thing. And lately, since Elon Musk bought Twitter, there's been a lot of a release of different documents. And one thing that came out, and it got up into Congress, and there's been, various hearings on it. And it was that some government actors were working pretty closely with Twitter people and saying, well, we got to review this, or we're not sure if this is information or disinformation. And you know, the FBI is kind of pretty big deal if an industry is told, well, look, we kind of have a question about this, you know, it's likely that they'd pull it, so that's understandable. And this was pretty pervasive.
Well, I think we'll take everybody back for a moment and really see where this started, because before Elon Musk bought Twitter for one specific reason, I believe he's one of the richest men in the world, and he saw what had been going on, the funny business, and Twitter was a fairly easy target for him. But it goes back to President Trump and all of the Russiagate and the fake dossier, and we've been hearing this ad nauseum. But there are some interesting characters in the FBI that for some reason during the Trump administration migrated after trying to get President Trump. They migrated to Twitter and ensured that the Twitter message was properly stated for their agenda.
Well, you do have James Baker, and he worked with the FBI, and I think he was involved in the FISA warrants. And what the FISA warrants are kind of secret warrants when you think there's some kind of international espionage going on. So it's not like a warrant process that you would normally do in a criminal investigation. You know, it's pretty top secret stuff. And, you know, you're saying, well, there's, you know, this is foreign espionage. So it's a pretty huge thing.
FISAs are specifically for foreign espionage. Right. But what we had seen and then since, we realized that the FBI were signing FISA warrants for non-foreign actors, including how
they would be doing the submittals, the affidavits.
Submitting, and the judge would be signing them, but they had a sign saying this is truthful. There's plenty of evidence supporting this FISA warrant.
Well, yeah, but there was a dossier, and I guess there was a big dispute of how valid that dossier was, and they were kind of leaning on that dossier, and it also mattered, you know, who paid for the dossier and who, you know, how.
Well, we can't relive all that, you know.
How the money went.
has covered some of this before.
But I mean, there was a lot of disputes on that. But anyway, so James Baker moved over to Twitter, and not only that, there was 80 past FBI agents who moved over to Twitter after they retired.
Well, that's kind of coincidental. That considering that Twitter was one of the main communication networks for the news. See, in the modern time, the CBS, NBC, and ABC have given way to the social media news outlets. And so what happens when you have something as easy to use as Twitter, in 120 characters or less, it's very simple that, well, if we control a medium such as Twitter, then the message that gets out regarding any subject we don't want you to know about can be censored.
Well, also I think there's, you know, you have, you know, MSNBC and you've got CBS and you have these, you know, media that have been around for a long time. And, you know, they have, and if you look back at the corporations that own them and control them, there's just several corporations that maybe six.
Very few corporations control the basic media.
Basically 6 corporations control all the newspapers and TV shows and everything else. And so, you know, if you get an interview with one, you know, then you have a platform. But with Twitter, no one has to ask you for an interview. You can just Twitter,
right?
You
can tweet.
And so that's kind of a new thing. And that obviously, according to the FBI, you know, they thought that was getting out of hand and that there should be some controls on that. And so there's a thing as that, you know, like Twitter or Facebook or whoever, YouTube, they've got a right to censor whoever they want. They're a private.
It's a private company.
Private company. There's no First Amendment right. It's not a government action. But what people are alleging here is that they acted as a joint actors. You know, that there was, you know, they were act as partners, and so the government and Twitter were working together. Now that brings in a First Amendment question.
Well, that's because under the First Amendment, if it's a government doing the censoring, that's clearly. But there's another part of that. If the government is using an agent to censor, and in this case, remarkably enough, it wasn't just past FBI agents that were working at Twitter. It was a regular where they would have weekly luncheons with the FBI, the CIA would even pop in. And James Baker, let me go back to Mr. Baker. he was the lead counsel on trying to impeach and work with the FBI to develop the evidence against President Trump. And that's a coincidence, but then he became the lead counsel at Twitter. And he was the one that was kind of ushering in more of the FBI agents. So you leave the FBI and you got a great job at Twitter, working, doing the same thing you were doing from 2016 to 2020. Now you're going to be part of Twitter. And it wasn't until Elon Musk started releasing the obvious trove of emails and messages and everything else from the internal workings of Twitter was this even brought to light.
Well, apparently there was, they've gone over about 150 emails that the FBI, and this is not retired FBI, working for Twitter.
Active.
These are the people working for the FBI, and they got 150 of these emails that were going to Yoel Roth, who was the safety chief at Twitter. And so, I think what they're saying is that, the American public needs someone to take care of them, because if they got some kind of misinformation, they don't really have the capability of deciding for themselves. Deciding for themselves what's true and what's not true, or what's correct and what's not correct. And so in a lot of ways, I think the FBI was just trying to help the American people because they didn't want them to get confused by some kind of different information. So I think that's kind of what they were trying to do.
Yeah,
there.
well, wait a minute. If the FBI is using Twitter as an active agent to censor, isn't that just stepping right on the First Amendment?
Yeah, I would say that there's a problem there because they're joint actors. And so that's really where it crosses the line. And some of these emails look like that. So, it's a very tricky thing. Now, when people think of the government censoring, they would just think of, the government itself would just shut you down. And Here you're kind of going through an intermediary. And, what kind of makes this a little questionable is that a lot of them were just like, well, we think you should review this. And then Twitter would say, well, we reviewed it, so we cut them off, right? And so the FBI didn't really tell them to censor them. They just said, this should be reviewed because we think it's Russian information, or we think it's this, or we think it's that. So, I think there's a lot of hints here, and they tried to make it as plausible deniability as possible, right? But I think the sheer volume of it is what they're getting at. And they're saying, well, this is a lot going on. If it was one little hint here and one little hint here, that'd be one thing. But they're saying, in these congressional hearings, they're cross-examining the guys, and they're going, well, how many times did you do this? How many people were working on this? And how often did you have these meetings between the FBI and Twitter? Were they weekly, monthly, daily? How many emails went back and forth? And they would, had a hard time remembering that, but now that they have some of these, communications. So I think it's the bulk of them that makes it a little bit...
suspect?
A little suspect, because even if it is just kind of a hint, right? Because asking someone to review something is not really forcing them to do it.
Okay.
But when the FBI asks you to review something, that's
well,
pretty
you're
serious.
supposed to look at that. Well, once again, Mark, this is a subject that we're going to see a lot coming up because there's congressional investigations.
Yeah, they're looking at it. Yeah.
So anyway, Mark, what's our final subject for the night?
Oh, and that's it. And also, FBI gave them $33.5 million for that.
They gave them some money,
they paid them. They paid Twitter for the time they spent working on these things.
Of course.
Okay, so the last one is a very, I don't know, with some trepidation, I even bring this up. It's the war in Ukraine, and you have Russia and Ukraine in a huge dispute, and it's a terrible tragedy. A lot of people are losing their lives, and there's a lot of civilian casualties, and it's just
a lot of destruction, Mark.
And it's just a terrible, terrible thing. Just a lot of people displaced, and the economy, of course, destroyed, and both sides taking tremendous casualties. So that's kind of what we've got here, and so that's an issue that you really can't avoid. It's not a pleasant thing to talk about.
Okay, well, we can't just start with what happened in the last 2 years, what led to this. We actually have to go back to 2014 and 2013. 2014, when Crimea was invaded by Russia, and with the president at that time, President Obama, and Joe Biden, by the way, was vice president, as we remember. There was a huge cry from Ukraine at that time how can we allow Russia to invade Crimea? But our administration at that time kind of squashed the Ukrainians from really going to war. We refused to give them any weapons to fight the Russians when they invaded Crimea. And in fact, the Obama administration said, we'll give you blankets. And that was a very big line that was repeated ad nauseum, that was the aid we gave Ukraine at that time. Well, we fast forward to now. And albeit there's issues between the company Burisma with
Metabiota
and with our president's son, which we're not talking about at this show. But I will say that President Biden has had his hands in Ukraine now, at least since we know in 2014 and possibly before that. But there's a bigger issue going on here. This war is tragic for every reason that you just brought up. But why is it being driven to be this tragic when, in fact, in the first 2-3 months of this war, a lot of European countries wanted to give them jets, wanted to give Ukraine full armament, but the U.S. said no, and then we started sending the old weapons, and there's been a drip from this country. If we're so upset about Ukraine and what's going on, why is it taking this long and we still haven't given them jets?
Yeah, well, I'm saying there's those issues. One really concerning issues are, first of all, Russia, Putin had said that he's not going to do the New START arms reduction treaty, and that's over nuclear weapons. So that's kind of scary, possibility of World War III.
Well, he's threatened to use nukes in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, that's pretty scary because you've got nuclear weapons involved, and that's not a good thing. Now there's another issue is like biolabs, and it's a huge dispute about that. And Victoria Nolan, U.S. Undersecretary of State, was being questioned about this in Congress, and she said, well, yeah, we do have some research materials that we want to prevent the Russians from getting, okay? And there's kind of a dispute between whether there's 46 of these labs or 26 of these labs, right? The Russians claim there's 46, and they said there's all kinds of, pathogens and plague, cholera, anthrax. And the U.S. position is, yeah, we might have that, but we're trying to do preventative measures with those. So there's a huge dispute and propaganda war about that, with the Russians saying the U.S. is violating the Biological Weapons Convention, the BWC. So there's that going on. The Chinese are getting involved in this too. And then there's another thing about energy. They said, well, sanction Russia. Don't let Russia sell
oil,
petrochemical to petrol to Germany, mostly, but and then the North Stream pipeline got demolished, blown up, and so that kind of drove Russia into the arms of China, because where are they going to sell their oil? Well, they're not going to sell to China, and that's not necessarily a good thing. That they're now relying on China, and then China just made a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia,
which is unheard of, by the way, in the modern world,
which is pretty amazing. And Saudi Arabia is saying, well, instead of taking the U.S. dollar as the petrodollar, we may be taking yuan now, and that's going to destabilize the dollar. So this has kind of stirred up a lot of issues that are huge global issues that nobody really knows how it's going to go, but it's not good on any level. It's and also the information coming out is completely 100 degrees. Everything is disputed. Everything coming out of there is disputed.
Well, we do know this is that for some reason the U.S. didn't fully support Ukraine with the armament they need, but we do know this. The U.S. has spent hundreds of billions of dollars for Ukraine, but a lot of that money's gone to U.S. arms manufacturers and dealers. So if we stand back from all the oh my God, the nuclear this and the nuclear that, we have to look at something else here. Is this a business deal that's going on? And the business deal is the lobbyists that pay the regime that runs our country, the lobbyists that ensure that money is made. And why couldn't we have won this war when, in fact, Russia is using almost World War II equipment? Why shouldn't this war be already over by us giving them the proper weapons in the first 6 months, not waiting to a year plus to give them a few missile batteries? And finally, I think Poland is going to give them MiGs. Now, if we'd given them advanced jets in the beginning, the Russians would not have been bombing every major city, including Kiev. And China wouldn't be, President Xi would not be over in Moscow having tea with Vladimir. So,
well, I think there's
there's a lot of things that, because of time, have marched on to what you said. Why is China in Arabia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Syria? Why is China there? We already know they've been doing for the last 2 years, they've been working hard in Africa to supplant the U.S. position there. But now they're supplanting what is our main, has been our main oil trading partner, Saudi Arabia. Iran, our arch enemy. Why is President Xi getting that much power? Because he's stepping with Putin, and now he's going, I'm going to be the police force of the world. The U.S. is not. So when you look at all this, who's making money? Why is our government not ending this war? In fact, our government has effectively stopped 3 truce times where the Russians and the Ukrainians have started talking truce, and the U.S. has stepped in and said, no truce. So this subject is so big, Mark. We can't even cover even a minuscule of it because each of these
I think your argument is that war is good business, and
war is good business.
And not only do you make a lot of money, selling the weapons and one thing and another, but you also can charge interest on the loans for that,
and loans for the weapons.
So there's it's big money, and the advantage of when you pay for a war, generally. If you say, well, we're going to buy a hospital, we're going to put it in a freeway, and then that, those things can go, belly up, and they can go bankrupt.
Right.
But a government can't go bankrupt. They can print more money.
Before we get too far,
tonight
was kind of an overview of Ukraine. So what we'll do on our in a future show is we're going to discuss Ukraine specifically, and we're going to go from there. How's that sound, Mark?
Well, it sounds good. Okay, well.
So welcome back to Law Talk.
Good to be back on Law Talk.
And for everyone tonight, I say, watch what's going on in the news. Pay attention. The world is passing us by very quickly. Good night, Mark.
Good night.